She was 31 years old. The winter, the town of Kettle Hollow decided it no longer owed her even a doorway, and she stood at the crossroads below the frozen river, with $4.60 knotted into the corner of a flour sack and not one house in that whole Minnesota Valley that would let her pass the threshold. She had been abandoned at birth, left in a butter crock on the church steps in the killing cold of 1856, and raised on the charity of a town that never once let her forget the debt of her own breathing. And when Cyrus Hale, who owned the bank and the mill and the ear of every deacon, decided her presence was bad for business, he saw to it that every door in Kettle Hollow closed at once. So she did the only thing a penniless woman could do to own a single square foot of the earth. She went to the county auction, and, for $4, she bought the one thing nobody else would touch, the old abandoned icehouse down on Slater's Bend, half sunk in the drift, its roof caving, its great doors frozen shut for a dozen winters. They laughed when her hand went up. A foolish woman buying a tomb of ice. But sealed beneath that ice, packed in sawdust and silence, something had been waiting 11 years to be found. Something that would not only change her life but give a dying town back its very ground. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you are watching tonight from some place the world has quietly written off, some town or life that others have decided is finished, stay with us to the end, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because this is a story about what is still worth something long after everyone has stopped looking. To understand what Adeline did in that ice house, you have to understand the child she was before the town taught her to be small. She had no mother she could name and no father the record would confess to. Only the woman the church paid to keep her a broad, weather-cured widow named Hannah Doyle, who ran the laundry behind the Lutheran meeting house and who, whatever the town said, never once made the girl feel like a burden borrowed against the collection plate. Hannah could not give her a family name that meant anything, so she gave her a trade instead, and it was the saving of her. From the time Adeline could stand on a crate to reach the wash kettles, Hannah taught her the patient chemistry of things people throw away. How lye and ash and rendered fat, boiled slow and stirred true, become soap fine enough for a banker's wife. How a stain the whole county had given up on would surrender to buttermilk and sun and time. How the wool a farmer cursed as ruined could be carded and washed and spun back to worth. There is no such thing as ruined, girl, Hannah used to say, her red hands never stopping. There is only value that folks have got too lazy or too proud to see. And Adeline believed her, because she had to, because she herself was a thing the town had thrown away, and she needed with her whole small heart to believe that discarded was not the same as worthless. So she grew up looking at the world sideways, the way you look at a field others have already picked over, hunting the good that remained. She learned to read the way a river reads a bank. From a broken primer Hannah pulled out of the rag pile, sounding out words by tallow light long after the laundry fires had banked. She learned figures from the shopkeeper's discarded ledger sheets, teaching herself to add a column so clean and quick that by 14 she was doing sums the grown men got wrong. And she learned, above all, to keep her own counsel, because a foundling with opinions was a foundling asking for trouble, and Hannah had not raised her to go asking. There was one more thing Hannah gave her, and Adeline would not understand its worth for 30 years. On winter nights, Hannah would tell her about the man who had built Kettle Hollow out of nothing, old Elias Kettle himself, the founder, who had come up the river valley in 1849 with a wagon of seed grain and a conviction that land ought to belong to the people who broke their backs on it. Elias had platted the town so that every family who came and stayed would earn title to their acres held in a common trust, protected from the speculators and the banks. And for 20 years, Kettle Hollow had been the one valley in the county where a poor man could not be turned off his own ground. He was a good man, Elias Kettle, Hannah would murmur. And he loved this valley like it was his own child. It's a shame what came after. But she never said what came after, and Adeline, drowsy by the stove, never thought to ask, and so the most important sentence of her life went by her in the dark like a train that does not stop. Hannah died the winter Adeline turned 26, quietly, in her sleep, with her red hands finally still, and something in the town's grudging tolerance died with her. For a few years, Adeline kept the laundry going alone, and she was good at it, better than Hannah had been, and the farm wives brought her their ruined things and marveled at what came back. She saved her coins in a tin behind the loose brick. She began, very carefully, to hope. And that hope was exactly what the winter of 1882 came to take. The fall, when it came, did not come like weather. It came like a man in a good coat. Cyrus Hale had bought the mill, and then the bank, and then, one by one, the mortgages of half the valley. And he had grown fat on a simple discovery that Elias Kettle's old common trust, the thing that protected every family's title, had never been properly recorded at the county seat after the founder died. The paper that proved the town's land belonged to its people had simply vanished 11 years before, and without it, Hale could go to a judge and claim that the trust had lapsed, that the deeds reverted, that the ground the farmers thought was theirs was in fact his, to mortgage, foreclose, and sell. He did it slowly, so no one town saw the whole shape of it. He did it with smiles and legal papers and small kindnesses that were really hooks. And when he came for Adeline, it was almost an afterthought, almost a sport. Her laundry sat on a corner lot he wanted for a new warehouse, a lot old Hannah had rented on a handshake that Hale now declared void. He raised her ground rent past all reason. When she could not pay, he bought the note on the little sums she owed at the mercantile and called them all due at once. And then, because a foundling with a clean reputation and clever hands was an inconvenient sort of woman to have watching him, he leaned on the deacons and the shopkeepers and the men who owed him money, which was all of them. And he made it known, without ever raising his voice, that anyone who gave Adeline Marsh work or shelter or credit would find their own notes suddenly, regrettably due. It is a terrible thing to watch a town you have washed clean for 30 years turn its face away one shopkeeper at a time. The mercantile would not sell to her. The church that had raised her found reasons its charity was fully spoken for. The women, whose wedding linens she had saved, crossed the street. And on a gray morning in December, with the river locked in ice, and her breath standing white before her, Adeline Marsh walked out of the only town she'd ever known with $4.60 in a flour sack and the whole valley at her back like a shut door. She could have left. That is what Hale expected, that she would drift to the railhead and be someone else's problem. But Adeline had been left once already, in a butter crock in the snow, and something in her would not be left again. She would not give him the satisfaction of her absence. She would stay, and she would own something, even if it was the least thing in the county, even if it was a joke. And so, 3 days later, cold to the bone and sleeping in the livery loft on the ostler's silent mercy, she read on the county board that the abandoned Kettle Icehouse on Slater's Bend was to be sold at auction for back taxes, and that the minimum bid was $4. The Icehouse had belonged to Elias Kettle himself. He had built it into the north bank of the bend, where the ground stayed cold. A great half-buried structure of field stone and thick timber, double-walled and packed with sawdust, where all through his life he had cut and stored the winter river ice to keep the town's milk and meat through the summers. After he died in the winter of 1871, the Icehouse had been let go, the doors frozen shut, the roof failing, the whole thing written off as a ruin too costly to tear down and too useless to keep. Nobody wanted it. That was precisely why Adeline did. On auction day, she stood in the cold courthouse hall in Hannah's mended coat, and when the auctioneer read out the frozen Icehouse and asked, half laughing, for any bid at all, she raised her hand and said, $4, in a voice that did not shake, and the room laughed, and Cyrus Hale, standing at the back in his good coat, smiled the way a man smiles at a thing already beaten. The gavel fell. For $4, Adeline Marsh owned a tomb of ice. She had 60 cents left and nowhere to sleep, and she had never in her life felt more like she owned the ground under her feet. It took her the better part of a day, with a borrowed axe and a bar of iron and her own stubborn shoulder, to break the great doors free of the ice that had sealed them for a dozen winters. When at last they groaned open, the breath of the place rolled out at her cold and clean and old, smelling of pine, sawdust, and river and time. Inside, the light fell in gray bars through the broken roof, onto a floor still packed, even in ruin, with the deep insulating sawdust Elias Kettle had laid down, and beneath it, incredibly, the ice remained. 11 summers had come and gone, and still, In the deep, double-walled dark of that founder's ice house, the old river ice lay locked and gleaming, because the man had built it that well. Adeline stood in the doorway and understood, in a slow-rising way, that she had not bought a ruin at all. She had bought the one perfectly working thing the town had decided was worthless, a great cold vault that still held. And a woman who could keep the valley in ice through the summer was a woman with something to sell. She began, that very afternoon, to clear it. She swept and shored and patched the roof with scavenged shakes. And it was while she was digging out the far corner of the deep chamber where the sawdust lay heaviest and the ice ran thickest against the north wall that her shovel struck something that was not stone and not ice. She knelt and brushed the sawdust away with her bare red hands, and there beneath a hand's width of clear old ice, dark and square and waiting, was the iron-bound corner of a chest. Her heart went very still. She had spent her whole life finding the worth in things others threw away, and she knew, kneeling there in the cold with her breath caught in her chest, that she had just found the thing the whole town had thrown away without ever knowing they had. She did not break into it that night. She was too cold and too wise, and some instinct told her that whatever lay under the founder's ice had waited 11 years and could wait one more. She banked a small fire in the old stovepipe, and she slept on the sawdust in her coat with the shape of that chest glimmering at the edge of her lantern light. And in the morning, patient as Hannah had taught her, she chipped the ice away a careful inch at a time so as to harm nothing beneath. It took 2 days. When at last the chest came free, a great oak strongbox bound in black iron. Its lock rusted, but its seams still true. She pried it open with the iron bar, and the lid rose with a sigh, and Adeline Marsh sat back on her heels in the cold gray light and looked at what the founder of Kettle Hollow had sealed into the ice before he died. It was not gold, though there was gold, a canvas sack of old coin, minted before the war, heavy as a sleeping cat, more money than she had seen in her whole life. But the gold was not the thing. Beneath it lay a great leather ledger, its pages perfectly preserved by the cold, and a thick bundle of letters tied in oilcloth, and folded flat beneath them all, a large document, heavy with wax seals, and the ribbon of the county recorder. Adeline's hands, that had never trembled at the auction or in the cold, trembled now as she lifted that sealed document to the light and read, in the careful copperplate of a dying man, the words at its head: "The Kettle Hollow Common Land Trust, recorded and attested, being the true and lawful title of the families of this valley to their several farms, held in trust and inalienable, that no bank, nor speculator, nor court shall ever put an honest family off the ground it has broken." It was the lost trust. It was the paper Cyrus Hale had spent 11 years swearing did not exist. The one document in all the world that proved the valley's land belonged to its people and not to him, and Elias Kettle had not lost it at all. He had hidden it in the coldest, safest, most forgotten place he owned, and then he had died before he could tell a living soul where. She read for the whole of that day, and long into the night, wrapped in her coat by the lantern, and the letters told her the rest. Elias Kettle, in his last winter, had grown afraid. He had seen the young banker Cyrus Hale for exactly what he was, seen how the man watched the valley the way a hawk watches a field, and he had understood that the moment he died, Hale would move against the common trust. So the old founder had done a careful, desperate thing. He had taken the original recorded trust and a fund of gold he had saved against hard times, and he had sealed them into the ice of his own icehouse, and he had written letters to the county judge, to the church, to the men he trusted, telling them where to find it. But Elias Kettle died in a February blizzard of 1,871 alone, faster than he had planned, and the letters were never sent. They lay in the chest with everything else, sealed under the ice with the truth. And Hale, moving fast in the confusion after the founder's death, had simply declared the trust lost and begun, year by patient year, to take the valley for his own. For 11 winters, the proof of every family's home had lain frozen 40 feet from the road, and no one had wanted the ice house enough to look. But there was one letter more, and this one Adeline read 3 times, and then a 4th, with the cold quite forgotten and her heart beating in her throat like a bird against a window. It was the last thing Elias Kettle wrote, and it was not about the land at all. It was about a child. In the winter of 1,856, the letter said, his own daughter, his only child, Margaret, sent away in disgrace by the founder's own hard pride for loving a man he had forbidden, had come back to the valley in secret, dying and destitute, with an infant in her arms. She had left the baby on the church steps in a butter crock because she was too ashamed and too near death to knock, and she had died that same week in a boarding house at the railhead without ever telling her father his grandchild lived. Elias learned of it too late, learned it only from the boarding house keeper months after, and the knowledge broke what was left of the old man's heart. He wrote, in a hand grown shaky, that he had watched that foundling grow up in the care of the laundry widow, watched her from a distance all his last years, too proud and too ashamed, and finally too frightened of scandal to claim her, and that he was sealing this confession into the ice alongside the trust so that someday, when the truth came out, the valley would know that the abandoned child of the church steps was Margaret Kettle's daughter, Elias Kettle's own blood, and the rightful heir to everything he had built. He did not know her name. The widow had named her, but he described the crock, and the church, and the winter, and the date. And Adeline Marsh, sitting in the ice house her grandfather had built, understood that she was reading the story of her own beginning, told by a dead man who had loved her from across a street and never once found the courage to say so. She wept then not for herself, exactly, and not only for the old man, but for the whole long, cold accident of it. The letters unsent, the child unclaimed, the truth 11 years under the ice, while a valley was quietly robbed of its ground. And when she was done weeping, she wiped her red hands on her coat and grew very calm, because she was Hannah Doyle's girl before she was anyone's heir. And Hannah had taught her that a thing of value is only worth something in the hands of someone with the sense to use it right. News of a woman living in the old Kettle Icehouse could not stay secret in a valley that small, and it was not long before word reached Cyrus Hale that Adeline Marsh had not left after all that she was down on Slater's Bend, clearing out the founder's ruin, and that she had been asking the ostler quiet questions about the county recorder's office. Hale was not a stupid man. He had spent 11 years afraid of one thing only. One piece of paper he could never quite prove was destroyed, and the mere shape of a clever woman poking through Elias Kettle's belongings put a cold finger on the back of his neck. He came to the ice house himself in his good coat, with 2 men from the mill on a hard, bright morning with the river cracking in the cold. He was pleasant at first, as he always was. He told her the ice house was unsafe, that he was prepared to be generous, that he would buy the lot from her for $50 a fortune to a foundling and let bygones lie. $50, and she could take the next train and start clean somewhere the past did not know her. Adeline stood in the doorway of her grandfather's ice house with the great cold dark at her back and looked at the man who had turned a whole town against her, and she said quietly that the ice house was not for sale. Hale's pleasantness thinned. He raised his offer to 100, then let his voice drop into the flat register the deacons knew to fear, and he reminded her of what he could do, how a woman alone, a foundling with no name and no friends, could be made to disappear from a valley without anyone troubling to ask where she had gone. And that was his mistake, because a man who threatens is a man who is afraid, and Adeline had spent her whole life learning to read the worth of things by how hard people worked to hide it. She said nothing to give herself away. She let him bluster and go. But that night she took the sealed trust and the founder's confession and the ledger, and she wrapped them in oilcloth, and she did not sleep in the ice house, because she knew now that fire was the one thing that could still destroy 11 years of frozen truth, and she knew that a frightened man in a good coat had 2 mill hands and a box of matches and everything in the world to lose. She was right to be afraid. What she did with her fear is the reason the whole valley remembers her name. She did not go to the county judge, though the judge was honest, because the judge was also slow, and a paper in a locked office is a paper that can burn in the night. Instead, Adeline Marsh did the boldest and most patient thing a discarded woman ever did in that county. She waited for the first Sunday of the new year, when every family in the valley crowded into the Lutheran meeting house, the same steps where she had been left in a crock 30 years before, and she walked in Hannah's mended coat, past all the faces that had turned away from her, and she stood at the front of the church and asked to be heard. The deacons moved to stop her. Cyrus Hale, in his pew, went the color of tallow, But there is a kind of stillness a person carries when they are holding the truth, and the congregation, curious and ashamed and half afraid, let her speak. And she read them the trust. She read them the recorded, sealed, lawful title to every farm in the valley. The paper Hale had sworn for 11 years did not exist, and as she read the names, the Olisons, the Brants, the Salverson place, the whole long roll of families who thought they held their land only at the banker's mercy, the meeting house went from silence to a sound like a rising wind, because every family in that room was hearing, for the first time, that their home was truly and forever their own. Then she read them the letters. She read them Elias Kettle's own words about how he had hidden the trust to save them and died before he could tell them where. And last, in a steady voice, with the whole valley leaning toward her, she read them the confession of the founder about the child on the church steps in the winter of 1856. And when she reached the end, and the room understood whose granddaughter stood before them in a laundry widow's coat, a silence fell over Kettle Hollow deeper than any ice. Cyrus Hale rose, to call it forgery, to bluster, to threaten, but the recorder's own seals were on the trust, plain for the honest judge in the third pew to see, and the founder's hand was known to the old men who had done business with him. And there was the gold, and the ledger in which Elias Kettle had recorded every family's rightful acres and figures that matched the county's own old plats. There was nothing left for Hale to buy, and no one left afraid enough to sell. The judge took the trust into the county's keeping that very afternoon, and within the year every foreclosure Cyrus Hale had built on the lie of the lost trust was thrown out, every family restored to its ground, and the banker himself, ruined by the reckoning of 11 years of fraud, laid open at once, sold his mill to pay what he owed, and left the valley in a plain coat on an ordinary train, unremarked the way he had once meant to send Adeline away. But here is the thing you must understand about Adeline Marsh, the thing that is the whole heart of it. She kept none of it for herself. She could have. The confession made her Elias Kettle's sole heir. The gold in the chest was lawfully hers. She could have taken the founder's fortune and his name, and lived the rest of her days in the fine house on the hill and let the valley thank her forever. And the valley, ashamed and grateful, would have let her. But Adeline had been raised by a woman who taught her that value hoarded is value spoiled, and she had spent 30 years learning what it is to be treated as a thing that belongs to no one. So she gave the gold to the common trust, to be kept, as her grandfather had meant it, a fund against hard winters, so that no family in Kettle Hollow would ever again be put off its ground for want of ready money. And she kept for herself only the Icehouse, only the cold, forgotten ruin she had bought for $4, because no one else would have it. She rebuilt it with her own red hands and the willing hands of neighbors who could not do enough for her now, and she cut the winter ice as her grandfather had, and all through the long summers she kept the valley's milk and meat and medicine cold. And a foundling who had once been turned out of every door in Kettle Hollow became the woman the whole valley depended on to keep what mattered from spoiling. There is a justice in that, so quiet and so complete, that the old men still speak of it in the low voices people save for things that feel like grace. She was 31 years old the winter the town of Kettle Hollow decided it no longer owed her even a doorway, and she stood at the crossroads with $4.60 and not one house that would let her in. Remember her there penniless, nameless, laughed at for buying a tomb of ice. Because the woman who walked out of that valley's contempt with a flour sack walked back into its meeting house a year later holding the deed to every home in it, and she gave it all away and kept only the cold ruin she had rescued. And in doing so, she became the one thing the town had insisted from her very first winter she could never be. Not a debt, not a burden, not a discarded child, but the keeper of the valley's worth. Elias Kettle hid the truth in the coldest place he owned because he believed the right person would one day be patient enough to dig for it. And the right person turned out to be the granddaughter he never dared to claim, who had learned from a laundry widow the one skill that mattered: how to see the value in what everyone else has thrown away. That was what waited under the ice. Not gold, in the end. A woman who was told her whole life she was worthless, finding, in the last thing anyone wanted, the proof that she never had been, and handing that proof, freely, to the very people who had shut their doors, because that is what worth does when it is finally in the right hands. It gives itself back. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end, and for letting Adeline's story keep you company for a little while tonight. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and that the thing others throw away is so often the very thing that saves us. Before you go, we would love to hear from you, so leave us this one thought in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that others had written off completely? We read every answer, and we are always humbled by what you share. Wherever you are watching from tonight, in whatever town or season the world has told you is finished, we hope you carry a little of Adeline's stubborn, patient hope with you into tomorrow. Until next time, stay close.